This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Whilst you're getting the handout, for those who weren't here last time, my name is Joseph. I teach at Henley Grammar School, not too far from here. And I teach literature, English, some years even media studies, depending on what's happening. And a mixture, really. And today we're really going to be focusing on the literary perspective section of the course. For those who haven't read the examiner's report, I really recommend that you do, because it does assuage some of your concerns. Like, should I use this? It's really not a prescriptive task. And I think one of the things that people are falling into are forgetting that really literary perspectives is, it's still, I mean, it doesn't have passage analysis per se, but it's still the same thing, really. You know, it's being able to show that you can analyse good writing. You know, analyse the work of the writer just through a lens, yeah? And you don't even need to name the lens. So, you know, a lot of people, my teacher didn't, last time we didn't, after the lecture, you know, my teacher didn't talk about this theory, or is the question, if you go back and look at the previous exams, and we'll do that, we'll go through, and you look at topics on nearly every one, there's an opportunity to bring in, so I didn't want to use I was putting together a sample one, and I didn't want to use one that any of you were doing, because so I just picked a text that was previously on the study design that isn't anymore, and it's poetry, so we can all quickly read 3 short poems to see how it's done. But basically, I'm applying, without saying it, a Marxist perspective, really, and a little bit of psychoanalysis as well, to a reading of these poems. But I'm not calling it that. I'm not stating that it's a Marxist one. I'm not stating that it's psychoanalysis, and I'm still really analysing the work of the poet. Yeah. The question, though, thank you. The question that I addressed in the sample one that we'll have a look at was about love, and we don't tend to think about love and Marxism as being sort of, I mean, the whole point actually of Marxism is to free up more time for love making, of course, but in the end what happens is everybody gets poor and they work harder and there's less love making. So essentially, but in theory it was supposed to have made time for more. So what I'm saying is, depending on, it really shouldn't matter if you're a good writer, a good thinker, if you've prepared and you've practiced, and practice is key. You know, I had to sit down and write this last night, and I haven't written anything since, you know, I don't know, start of the year when I was getting all my resources ready, like not writing long-form essays, and it takes time. It took me over an hour to do it. The more you practice, the better you get. So, we'll just so I have an indication for Section A, Literary Perspectives, it's just an indication of what text you're doing for Section A. North and South. You don't know yet which one you'll choose, yeah? Cool. Cool. All right, so a lot of people are in Heart of Darkness, which is the most popular one, I think. No one's doing Pygmalion, no? Is that off now? I don't know, is that still on? I think it is. All right, so if you have a quick look, we'll have a quick look up here. Let me just get this up. I think that's the right one. Come on. Yep. All right. So basically the first page of this report, if you haven't read it, it's just a quick reminder, gives you a pretty clear indication of what you have to do. You have to respond to a topic. The topics are pretty open, and offer a perspective from which you're reading the text. Some ignore the topic. That's like cardinal sin 101. It's pretty obvious when you do that. It's even often, even when I'm marking essays, I sometimes have noticed that my students, I can see the previous topic coming through in the one that I've given them. So I've given them one to do in class, because the last few weeks we've just been practicing, and I can actually see the one that they've written for homework a few days earlier coming through in this one. And you don't want to do that. There's often this thing, I'll cheat. I'll find the go-to quotes, the recyclable ones. No, write your own topics, get together with friends, write as many as you can. Write strange ones that you know, and then gather quotes and evidence around that topic. And not just quotes, but examples of the writer at work, where there's your quotes that are about what's happening and about the characters, but quotes that enable you to show the artistry of the writer, no matter whether they're a poet or whatever. No one's doing poetry for this section, right? Oh, you are. You're doing Ariel, yeah. So I think poetry can work well for this section too. They all can, really. Although I must admit, some of the times, I think it'll be interesting. You've got to be careful with some, particularly like Agamemnon and things like that. For instance, if you just have a look here at the topics that they've got up. Actually, Agamemnon was all right in that particular one. Like this one. Yeah, what do you have to be careful of with a question like that? Even if you don't study 12th night, you should be able to tell me what you have to be cautious of.
Is it also possible if you could zoom in?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Of course. I feel... Okay, hang on. I'm a Mac user and this is not a Mac, so I don't even know how to do it. Does that do it? Yeah, okay. All right, is that better? So, what would you have to be cautious of in a question like this? Even if you haven't studied 12th Night or Shakespeare, you should be able to.
Like a very specific role, because it suggests ambiguity.
Yes, that's true, but particularly the thing is that Shakespeare's not particularly... Yes, so you were going to say?
You have to probably convey that you're actually, you have to recognise the text type before answering the question.
That's right. And also the period of the text. So what you have to distinguish between is your reading of it and the author's writing of it more clearly. Because Shakespeare's not concerned really with gender roles in the modern context in the way that we are. I mean, all the roles are played by men. Do you know what I mean? And whilst Shakespeare's obviously a progressive for his time, by our contemporary standards, I'm sure he's, well, let's put it this way, he got his wife, Anne Hathaway, pregnant at 19. It was a shotgun wedding. And then left her in Stratford while he cavorted around London being a theatre writer and barely went back and she raised the children. He only saw her once or twice a year. So, and didn't particularly like her either, apparently. So, the idea is that you have to be cautious with certain things that you're not applying. You need to be careful particularly when dealing with texts that are written in the past, about the lens you're applying from the modern perspective. And being able to distinguish between those two things. Yes, you're offering a reading of the text, so it's perfectly okay to talk about, because 12th Night is not a fixed thing. It's read, the way we see it or watch it or read it today is just as valid as how Shakespeare wrote it. But it may not, but it's not how they intended necessarily. I often think sometimes writers don't intend, they just do, yeah.
So before reading, can you stand as if it's like a fact, or do you have
No, you can't. It has to be you can't. It's not a fact. In fact, you should avoid stating things as... When I say stating things as fact, we'll have a look at the sample one, some extracts from the sample ones, because you also don't want to be completely non-committal in your analysis. So, but yes, you should be, I guess, setting up briefly that it's a reading. Yeah, it's in the language that you use. So what I highly suggest you do is in this examiner's report here, go through, there are only four published samples, and some of them are, like the one on 12th night, for instance, where is it? Yeah, here they are. The one on 12th night, some of them are very verbose, but what you should do is read through them, and I think last time I was with you, in fact, it might even be in the back of this handout again. Yeah, it is. I've gone through and sort of done it on the back page there for you. You don't need to read the text. Read the sample ones on the other texts as well. And sometimes it's better to read them on texts you haven't written on. And go through and find the phrases they're using. See how they're doing it. These are the high scoring responses from last year. See, these are not literary perspective samples. These are passage analysis samples. But if you go on to the examiner's report from this year, you'll see that there are these 5 samples, and read through it and actually highlight their phrases. Look at where they're raising their perspective and what kind of language they're using to do it. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably my advice. If you have a look here, like for instance, let's have a look quickly at this Heart of Darkness introduction, because we'll be able to see how they've done it here. Just to remind you, to what extent is Conrad's Heart of Darkness an indictment of colonialism? Yeah. So you have to be, again, wary because it's written in a colonial context. You know, like today, although for his time Conrad may have been different to the norm in the way that he thinks about colonisation, it's certainly not our modern view of colonisation as inherently exploitative. Yeah. So you have to be careful that you don't, you're doing the reading of your interpretation on the perspective you're applying, but also of the author and their context. Yeah. So let's have a look at how this student's done it in the introduction. An indictment of colonialism. Through the destabilisation of Marlowe as moral and representational authority, Joseph Conrad reveals the sordid reality of colonial invasion and delivers a scathing indictment of colonialism in Heart of Darkness. Highlighting the ways in which the binaries of lightness and darkness, European progress and African primitivism, and finally the active and knowing sphere of masculinity and passive and naive sphere of femininity are constructed and utilised in Marlowe's narrative, he serves to reveal the contingency and fallibility of the notions of civilised values that underpin the imperialist cause. It's very wordy. The two colonising ideologies of empire and gender thus operate collusively within the novella, allowing Marlowe to distance himself from his own complicity in the annexation and exploitation of Africa. Because that points, to me, is the qualifier. Because Conrad is a part of that colonial process. Do you see? Like, it's not our reading today of it. So you do have to be careful when doing it. If you have a look at some of the other ones here, I'm just trying to see what are the ones you're doing. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Some people are doing that. Discuss the proposition that characters in William's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof are alone because they fail to deal with the inadmissible things in life. Now, that's actually a really broad one. And you could apply a reading of any kind. You don't even need to have named, you don't have to have a named critical perspective. So you don't have to have studied psychoanalysis or done a feminist reading or queer reading of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. You just need to have read some reviewers. Find one that you agree with. And my advice is you only need to name one. But to be able to build your discussion, find a reading of the text, or your teacher's given you readings of the text. Pick the reading that you agree with, that you think is, I support a lot of this reading. And then pick a reading that you find problematic, that you're less supportive of. And even though you're only going to, because in this task you only have to use one, you don't have to use two, and you don't even need to name it, by the way. Use the other one as a way to counterpoint, and then go through the two readings, find the extracts that you support and that you disendorse, that you would challenge, or that you partly agree with but not fully agree with, and then go back to the text and gather the evidence under them. And then what you then do is apply those readings to topics. Now that topic there, you can tackle that through any kind of lens, really. So if we have a quick look at this examiner's report again, at the top, just to clarify for those of you who haven't read it, we'll just have a read over this bit. Don't ignore the... Can everyone see? No, hang on. There we are. Right. Some students, however, ignored the topic and presented a prepared response, while others answered the question but did not address a literary perspective. Now that doesn't mean that you have to name the perspective, because they qualify this in a minute. Some spent too much time explicating the literary perspective or critique, and not enough time on engaging with it or presenting their own view. So don't give the examiner a lesson on psychoanalysis or postmodernity. That's not the task. There are areas, that's another task, but it's not this task. Yeah. So that's secondary. You're answering the question using the text with the perspective that you've studied as a way to support your reading or challenge your reading. Yeah. Challenge the topic. Students need to be able to respond to the topic, the perspective, and the text at the same time, with their own reading of the text remaining the focus of their response. So we need to see your opinion. So you have the critic's opinion, another opinion perhaps to sort of reflect that, and somewhere within those two sits your own. Yeah. The underpinning idea is that by debating views with other readers, we arrive at a better clarification and expression of our own responses. I do think that literature is the best subject to study with someone else. You know, it really is, but that person has to have done the work. So if there's two of you who have done the work, or you're doing the same text, and you're coming to the table having done the close reading and the preparation, it's definitely the best subject to study for like that, provided that you write something at the end. Every time you study for literature, you must write. And it's not like studying for another subject. You don't study for it in a little 1 hour. Let me do my timetable. No. You study for it all day. In fact, it's better to study at night for literature, in my opinion. You know, you need candles, wine, I don't know, incense, and you study, and then you have a friend over in the bedroom, then you stop and make love, and then you study. That's the best way to do it. Talk about the books. But it is good. It's one of those ones where sharing your ideas with someone else can be a good thing, if they've done the preparation. Students need to be able to... You can study for literature horizontally too, because you can study in bed, on the toilet. Students need to be able to respond to the topic, the perspective and the text. The underpinning idea is that by diverting... Okay. It should be understood that the literary perspective does not have to be an identifiable school of thought. Right? So don't panic if you haven't learned about, feminism, and there's 16 schools of feminism anyway. Some of them disagree with... It's like, religion. The Sunnis and the Shiites hate each other more than the Christians and the Muslims half the time. It's the same here with feminism or psychoanalysis or Marxism. People within the same collective disagree more vehemently than they do with people outside of it sometimes. It could be, for instance, a review of the introduction to the edition of the text that you use. Yeah? That's as simple as it is. Some people are just studying the introduction to the text that they've studied. Moreover, students do not need to name the authors or the titles of the critiques they are using. So you can, by all means, name the critic you're referring to, but you don't have to. You don't have to name what canon they're in, or which school of thought they're in. Some students were very specific about the literary articles they had chosen, for example, naming Achibi or Said on Heart of Darkness. But others adopted a more general stance, naming a Freudian perspective, a queer reading, or a post-colonial lens, or merely using the discourse of feminism, so just the language of it, or of class inequality, not necessarily Marxism, or psychosocial development as examples. So it can become clear without you naming it. No single approach was prescribed or expected. It is important to understand that there can be multiple ways of reading a text and many nuances within a particular school of thought. The words, to what extent, discuss, reflect on and consider in the question. So remember, the questions are phrased in one of those four ways. To what extent do you agree? To what extent do you agree? Or how far do you agree? Discuss, reflect on and consider. Signal the opportunity to challenge the ideas put forward in the topics, acknowledging the point made, but offering another equally valid and substantiated perspective. Literature students shouldn't be absolutists. Yeah, I have a student every year that always wonders, you know, not to gender stereotype, but actually no, last year it was a boy, but often it's a very strong-willed woman, and I'm like, your opinions are a little too strong for these essays. I'm all happy for you to have them, but I don't want to see them coming across in here without any caveats. Because the whole point of literature is that absolutism stinks. Yeah? Fundamentalism is not creative. It's ideological. So you can have that lens, but it shouldn't be. You need to address the tensions, the implications, that's the word, implications, yeah, of the prompt. Not just sort of, I agree, I completely disagree. And in the one I've written here, and which we'll have a look at in a minute, I do disagree with the prompt, but I acknowledge parts of it too. So you could go through and read the essays later on. Students were asked to use only one literary perspective, even though in their coursework they addressed two or more. Most students understood that this limitation implied that the examination task was not a replication of the coursework task. So you're not doing exactly the same thing as your SAC. It's more circumscribed now. You have a question. Several students did, however, introduce a second perspective. However, unless it was an integrated perspective, and you can read the above extract later, the addition of the second perspective did not always help the student, as it often detracted from a more detailed account of the initial one from the discussion of the topic. So by all means, you can bring one in. You're not going to penalise you for doing it. But they're also warning that be careful not to kind of contradict yourself entirely. If you're going to raise another one, it needs to be reconciled with the other one, the first one. Likewise, don't do it at the expense of ignoring the topic. So you can do it. This is free. You know, it's supposed to be creative. This is about creativity. So they're not prescriptive. Responses in the upper range showed a detailed and sophisticated understanding of a chosen literary perspective, named or not, and were able to debate it in relation to the text, using appropriate discourse to offer considered and relevant response to the topic. Responses in the middle range generally showed an understanding of the task, but often presented prepared responses that did not fully address the topic or did not show subtlety, complexity, or detailed analysis of either the text or the perspective. For example, some responses on A Doll's House. Is anyone doing that? A Doll's House is, yeah. It's a Norwegian text, woman trapped in a loveless marriage. Yeah. A Doll's House did not address the question of how individuals may conform to the expectations of others, and wrote only about the ways women were shaped by social expectations. So, whereas the topic itself invited a broader consideration. So it's you've got to be careful with this. Yes, the main character of the text is a woman, and yes, the text is about the stifling nature of what it is to be a woman in the late 1800s in Norway, in a middle-class family. But really it's not about that, because that's our modern reading of it. Because Ibsen wasn't particularly worried about women in the 1890s. I mean, he was a patriarchal kind of contemptuous of. Often the women in his plays, they're intelligent, but they're also twits. And this, as much as we feel that Nora's trapped in A Doll's House, she's also a twit. But she can't, and from our modern reading, would be like, well, of course she's a twit. She can't help but be one because she's oppressed. You know what I mean? Like, what's there for her to be? But that wasn't his consideration of it. What he kind of thought was that bourgeois people were twits. Do you know what I mean? Women or not. So, you have to be careful, like, don't kind of make, at the same time, is, you know, if you've done a feminist reading or whatever, don't ignore the topic. Yes, you can bring that reading in, but you have to also reconcile the full topic. And in that topic, it wasn't the women in a doll's house, it was in a doll's house, the characters. Yeah. Low-scoring responses did not always put forth any perspective and limited knowledge of the text. All right, so what we'll do now is if I get you to have a look here, because we'll come back to passage analysis shortly. So I've quickly put 3 poems in here. If you turn to page 4. So we'll read the poems together, and then I'll quickly give you each one poem, and we'll give you 5 minutes to go over it, and then we're going to read the sample one, yeah? So just to give context, John Forbes, he was on the text list until I think he went off in 2015. He's an Australian poet, died in the late 90s from he was addicted to all kinds of things, cough medicine largely. Back when cough medicine in the good old days used to have meth in it. And he was addicted, of course, also to methamphetamine. So we couldn't get it until cough medicine. So he died, and he is probably kind of he's probably like Australia's version of Rimbaud, if you know the French poet Rimbaud. Very rebellious poet, and his poems were on the text list for quite a long time. So for about 8 years. So we'll read them together. He's writing in the 90s, so these poems are all from the 90s, the early 90s. All right, the first one's called Love Poem, and I think we might have read it last time, but we'll read the other 3. Love Poem. Spent tracer flecks Baghdad's bright video game sky as I curl up with the war in lieu of you, whose letter lets me know my poems show how unhappy I can be. Perhaps, but what they don't show until now is how at ease I can be with military technology, e.g., matching their fur spree, I classify the sounds of the Iraqi AA, the thump of the 85mm, the throaty chatter of the quad ZSU-23. Our precision-guided weapons make the horizon flash and glow, but nothing I can do makes you want me. Instead, I watch the West do what the West does best, and know obscurely as I go to bed, all this is being staged for me. So, obviously an unusual love poem, in that it's about the first Gulf War, in Iraq in the 1990s. The next one, on Tubelo's Banquet of Cleopatra. I don't know if you've seen this painting in the National Gallery of Victoria. It's one of their more expensive paintings. By Giambattista Tiepolo, and it's the story of Antony and Cleopatra. Yeah, and Cleopatra here on the left is holding a pearl that she's threatening to drop into like acid, essentially, to dissolve the pearl. Yeah, and of course you know that the story of Antony and Cleopatra, basically their great love story is that they basically jeopardised their people. You know, they were conflicted between doing what was right for their people and Cleopatra in the end, of course. You know, the snake, the asp. Does my asp look big in this? I often say that. So, the asp, you know, is the snake, and she killed it. All right. But for John Forbes, Antony and Cleopatra basically suck. So this is one of the most famous love stories of all time, and John Forbes is like, I'm not interested. Quite frankly, egomaniacs. So let's read. Any frayed waiting room copy of Who, page 5, any frayed waiting room copy of Who could catch this scene. Flash, Eurotrash, surveys a sulky, round-faced Uber babe who's got the lot. What else could this painting mean except that superstars can will their luck? Or just how little raw envy is hidden by contempt? So words like wow, great tits, or comic opera wop sum up the observer. Not Antony and Cleopatra, attached to pets and entourages, our contemporaries, minus Coke and sunglasses. What's that pearl without price she's dropping in her glass? A mirror of their self-regard, replaced by each other's glances. Still, it glows, blue and blank at the centre like their hearts, flanked by idlers on balconies leering and placing bets. But if they suggest Eros, what role does Agape play in this? Downstairs and screaming, being shown the instruments. You wish, Foyer, you wish. So he's much more cynical about the story of Antony and Cleopatra. He kind of sees it as, you know, like, I don't know, he's Brad and Angelina or something, you know. And where the people up, you know, placing bets up here. Eros is the god of the son of Aphrodite, the word erotic comes from eros. Yeah. He's a taking love, a self-serving love, self-satisfying love. And agape is the self-sacrificing love, the love that gives rather than takes, in Greek mythology. And then the last one is written at as the Berlin Wall came down. So he was watching the television. I remember this as a kid too, watching the television. You've probably seen footage of it, the Berlin Wall falling down. And it's called Ode to Karl Marx. Old father of the horrible bride whose wedding cake has finally collapsed. You spoke the truth that doesn't set us free. It's like a lever made of words no one's learned to operate. So the machine it once connected to just accelerates, and each new rap dance video is a perfect image of this. Bodies going faster and faster, still dancing on the spot. At the moment though, this setup works for me, being paid to sit and write and smoke, thumbing through Adorno like New Idea on a cold working day in Ballarat, where adult unemployment is 22%, and all your grand schemata of intricate cause and effect work out like this. Take a muscle car and wire its accelerator to the floor. Take out the brakes, the gears, the steering wheel, and let it rip. The dumbest tattooed hoon, mortal diamond hanging round the mall, knows what happens next. It's fun unless you're strapped inside the car. I'm not, but the dummies they use for testing are. So, what's interesting in this poem is that as communism collapsed, the world was very happy in the 1990s, the wall's come down, Cold War's over, but Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are leading the free world, mate. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not that good. Trump is, the president. That's great. Wow. And just there's one more, the essay mentions one more, so we'll just quickly read this one. What's funny is one's called an ode, love poem, ode to Karl Marx, like when you write an ode when you're in honour of someone, and this one's a pastoral. What kind of poems are pastoral? A pastoral, like, sings the praises of something, It's fun to take speed and stay up all night. Not writing those reams of poetry just thinking about is bad for you. Instead, your feelings follow your career down the drain and find they like it there, among an anthology of fun ideas bound together by a chemical in your blood that lets you stare the TV in its vacant face and cheer, consuming yourself like a mortgage. And when Keats comes to dine or Flaubert, you can answer their purities with your own less negative ones. For example, Dransfield's line that once you become a junkie, you'll never want to be anything else? Well, I think he died too soon. As if he thought drugs were an old-fashioned teacher and he was the teacher's pet, who just put up his hand and said quietly, "Sir, sir," and heroin let him leave the room. So Dransfield's another famous Australian poet who died of a heroin overdose. They were not friends, kind of rivals of each other in the 90s. So, what I'll get you each to do is I'll just get you, if you do first two rows, we just have a look at the first poem again. And actually there's some questions on the first poem, so you can go through those, that might help. The next two rows can have a look at the second poem, the one about Cleopatra, and if the last three rows can have a look at the final one about Ode to Karl Marx quickly. I'll give you 10 minutes to have a look at it, and then we'll read the perspective. So I applied a Marxist and psychoanalytical perspective to the reading, but just read them for what you think they might be going on. But don't look for the perspective, look at the poetry. Look at the structure, what's unusual. So go through it quickly. And then we'll read the sample essay and talk about it. See what you notice about the structure, the tone, the metaphor. The irony.
just realised you need more light.
Oh yeah, I mean, the right structure makes everything but there's a sense of the structure, but it's an illusion. There's actually not a structure. A couple of terminologies. The examiner is not a rhyme, That's true, yes. That's true, yeah. Why do you reckon the second one stands alone? What's the second one? What is the second one? It's the most prolific one. And you think, like, the rest of the columns, what's interesting is the column starts as a sliding block. The column is the same. What moves it? So when do it's written for a lot of things. Why is it not? Yeah, I'm suffering and I'm hungry in the way that he is. And as long as like we understand, like we don't see the suffering on the man, the vision, in the way that we watch the world television, like things going across the sky, you can actually see what's happening on the street. It's a strange thing. What a love story. His love is the person what I love. So there's love for war. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Totally. That's exactly right. And the feeling that we have, well, you know, you say red love, not war, or if you can't find love. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. It's a strange point. It's a strange point, and you can really feel like the personal and political leaning into love. And even like a ridiculous love can be. Yes. And it's interesting, like, the love that is getting, and she's like, hey, I like the war. Do you know what I mean? I like watching the war itself. And it's a strange, almost like an art. He's like, there's an element of fuck you to the compliment. He's upset because he's just like, he's recently. Yeah, like, yeah. Because actually, I'm unhappy because my songs are unhappy because there's a validation. That's what yeah, there is. Yeah, the precision of it. Like, yeah, and also like, what is it? Precision. Yeah. I sort of read that one. Yeah. That's right. What about like the horizon? I know the horizon touch is like kind of evoking something like this Hollywood style love or some kind of focus of war. Look, clubs are very much wonderful when students are writing. It's very challenging to be able to meaning kind of things. Like one word, meaning leading away from you, grasping it, it's like holding water. I think the word obscure here is emphasized for that reason. He himself is okay, guys, what did you notice going on here?
All right. Let me see. So I'll put this. I'll get this to put up on the portal too, because I think this is on the portal that you can access. All right. So we talked about the poems and how in my reading here, I kind of thought, well, I'll apply a bit of a Marxist reading to them, but it's not like a deeply politically Marxist. It's sort of just, I guess it's a reading about class rather than about Marxism per se. But the question was, despite its humour, John Forbes' poetry is abrasive and loveless. To what extent do you agree? Yeah. So this was, I've got to address these things. I've got to deal with it's being, whether I think it's humorous and what kind of humour it has. Is it humorous? It kind of like, what kind of is? It's sort of humorous in that kind of like darkly satirical, but it's Australian humour, definitely. It's a little bit like, you know, when you call someone, you know, yeah, it is. It's Australian humour, but it's definitely it's rough, it's gruff, yeah, it's sardonic, yeah. And sometimes it's black. It's very dark. Poetry is abrasive. What does abrasive mean? Harsh, yep, and loveless. Yeah. To what extent do you agree? So straight away you want to try and tackle some kind of show a reading. Yeah? I don't think the poems are loveless at all. No, really. I think they depict a world that can be loveless, but I don't think they're loveless. So that's my reading on the poems. John Forbes' poems incisively blend popular culture, politics and the personal in abrasive yet poignant scenarios. The rapid-fire speed at which the poems are grammatically structured conveys the harsh, sometimes drug-addled urgency of Forbes' idiom, which, despite its frequent pessimism, is often also caustically funny. It is also imbued with a pathos that lurks tentatively among the cynicism, one that suggests the poems are not devoid of a loving sensibility. Yeah. So, like, think of Agape downstairs being tortured, that's where the love is. Yeah. on the torture track, but she's down and she's screaming, she's still there. The humorous headline from the gossip magazines, which Forbes parodies on Tupelo's Banquet of Cleopatra, such as Wow, Great Tits and Comic Opera Wop, are undercut by his reminder that privileged and famous people can will their luck, and that when we, the public, are their voyeurs, we perpetuate their inflated status and our own subjugation. Forbes's poems can undoubtedly be abrasive, evident in pejorative observations such as still the pearl without price glows, blue and blank at the centre like their hearts, flanked by idlers on balconies leering and placing bets. He pillories the famous love story of Antony and Cleopatra as trashy, their blank hearts reflecting a false, hollow and heartless kind of love, one that he recognises in our own culture's misplaced worship of modern celebrities and their love lives. However, when taken as a whole, Forbes' oeuvre is imbued with pathos for everyday people's struggle to cope in a cruel, corrupt and unjust world. And in this way, his own complicated love for the underdog, the oppressed, the addicted and the loveless becomes apparent. There is an empathetic love expressed for the marginalised in Forbes' poems, but also a sense of the harsh and brutal reality they endure. So sometimes there's a topic sentence, like that's a topic sentence. And other times there's not. It's straight in, like in the previous paragraph, it's straight into close reading. Yeah. So what you've got to make sure that you're doing, though, is you need to keep saying, okay, I've gone 5 or 6 lines, because this is what can happen, and I noticed it in the sample ones too. I've written 5 or 6 lines, or I've written, I don't know, 80 words, 100 words. Am I actually making a point about the prompt? Because sometimes you get so caught up in your idea and you think, I'm dealing with it. And you've dealt with it, but you're leaving me to do the interpretation. And I only get paid like $1.20 to read the paper. I don't do the interpretation. You have to do it for me. You know, so you don't want to leave them to water, give the sense that you're going to link, or not link as in just repeat the topic, but unpack, deal with the implications of the topic, and then not do it. So keep saying to yourself, like, keep that page open there, and every 10 lines or so, look back at that page and say, am I dealing with all parts of this topic? Yeah. Or have I implied it? And if you've just implied it, sometimes you need to actually state it. Not some simplistic statement, but a meaningful statement that deals with the implications. There is an empathetic love expressed for the marginalised in Forbes' poems, but also a sense of the harsh and brutal reality they endure. That's actually bad grammar. But anyway. The irony of the couplets in Ode to Karl Marx and Love Poem create the illusion of a structure that is actually designed to thwart the reader so as to confront them with their complacency. The rhyme schemes, when they occur at all, do not mirror the poem's frequent jarring enjambment and line breaks. Ode to Karl Marx, the title of which is indicative of the poet's regard for Marx's socialist theories, explores Forbes' fear that the collapse of the Berlin Wall will mean the machine it once connected to, that is, neoliberal capitalism, just accelerates. While there is a pessimism and cynicism to the poem, evident because for Forbes himself this setup works, getting paid to sit and smoke, there is also a concern for what awaits those who struggle on a cold working day in Ballarat where adult unemployment is 22%. Awareness of such socio-political concern is not the work of a loveless poet. Rather, it reflects his frustration with the systemic disregard or lack of love for others. The poet also exhibits respect for the unwitting and unheralded knowledge of the streetwise. The dumbest tattooed hoon, mortal diamond hanging around the mall, knows what happens next. Their continued exploitation is inevitable now. The reader is fatalistically reminded through the sympathetic oxymoron mortal diamond that the everyday consumer cannot will their luck. This lends the sense that in the neoliberal post-Cold War zeitgeist, you can briefly distract yourself from life's ephemerality, while at the very same time you're trapped inside a car that hurtles towards inevitable annihilation. The second-person pronouns you and your recur throughout many of Forbes' poems, and like in the final line of Ode to Karl Marx, they often come as a jolt near the denouement. This direct address, it's fun unless you're trapped inside the car, which comes late in the poem, can be read as a statement of tough love, one that violently awakens us as readers to the fact that our own culture's promotion of self-fulfillment actually masks our servitude. While the poems themselves are indeed abrasive, Even crude at times, the urgency conveys a confrontational love for humanity, one that alerts us to the instruments which are used in Antipolo's banquet of Cleopatra to torture the selfless and giving goddess of love, Agape, while Eros, who represents self-gratifying love, celebrates the narcissistic conceit Forbes associates with Antony and Cleopatra from Tiepolo's painting. A gentle love is certainly there amongst the modern sea of Forbes's poems, but like Agape, it is downstairs and screaming from the dungeon. Australian critic Ken Bolton writes about those who dislike Forbes's poetry for its negativity, that it is truly gormless to suggest that poets must only express nice thoughts that lead to hope. Bolton also regards John Forbes as being exemplary of a process which combines the constant rereading and rewriting of the myths one lives by. Indeed, Forbes's poems confront and subvert the hackneyed and commodified Hollywood tropes about what love is and what it can do. In Love Poem, which is addressed to an unrequited love interest, the speaker relays the comfort he feels watching war footage on television in lieu of his love unreturned. The poem is shocking because the violence of Baghdad's bright video game sky seems sanitised, and because of this, it offers a perverse comfort to the lovelorn man. Despite precision-guided weapons that make the horizon flash and glow, there is nothing the speaker can do to make his beloved want him. Love Poem indicates that Forbes's poems are not devoid of love. Rather, they are about a love so intense that it can be dangerous, whether that be a love for a person, a drug, or even for the vocation of writing poetry itself. In Speed, a pastoral, Forbes writes that it's fun to take speed and stay up all night, not writing those reams of poetry just thinking about is bad for you. He shows how love can be all-consuming and destructive. While in Love Poem, he conflates the loss of romantic love with a battlefield, in this poem he confesses that the all-consuming, cerebral act of writing poetry can leave one emotionally depleted, as your feelings follow your career down the drain and find they like it there, consuming yourself like a mortgage. For Forbes, the harsh truth is that to love a person, a drug, or an artistic practice is a trade-off, because you must gamble your peace of mind when you enter the fray. The myths we are sold about love are presented as an anthology of fine ideas bound together by a chemical in your blood. Like capitalism, they are addictive because of the promise they offer, but can also be all-consuming. In Antipolo's Banquet of Cleopatra, the famous love story of Antony and Cleopatra is mocked by Forbes as insincere, emblematic of a sick obsession with power and narcissism, while in Speed, a pastoral, drugs replace the anguished love the poet has for his confounding art, which is portrayed as an old-fashioned teacher, capable of both cruelty and nurturing. In Ode to Karl Marx, Forbes pities humanity's path to destruction, as rampant capitalism sees us darkly and comically hurtle toward oblivion. Perhaps most poignant, though, is Love Poem, which suggests that if there is no love to be found elsewhere, then war can, like a narcotic, offer cold yet seductive comfort. Rather than being loveless, Forbes's poems are about the complicated nature of human desires that can surfeit, are often thwarted, and can transmogrify. John Forbes' works do not promote a loveless world, but they do depict one where love can be savage, elusive, and misplaced. So, the things to find are your lines. What is my reading is in there. Yeah? And there are lines, if you go through the work, you like things like this. Yeah? That's you. That's the reader. There's the critic, there's Marxism. What I was trying to do here is to cover all the things that the examiners say, you can cover. I've named a critic, you don't have to name one. I've not named Marxism, but the poem does it for me, and I'm using the language of Marxism quite clearly. Love Poem is really also about psychoanalysis, so in talking about Forbes's Freudian slip, Forbes's exploration of love in Love Poem, it looks at the idea of sex and death that psychoanalysis talks about. So, and their connectedness. So, what you need to be able to do, that's 1,100 words, so slightly longer than you would write, I think, or 1,200 words. So, you need to, it needs to be about 900 to 1,000 words you want to try and write. But it comes with practice. So what you should do is go and find those prompts, write these essays, but then still be able to adjust. Like, I had to keep reminding myself throughout writing this, the humour. That's like, and I actually did realise I'd forgotten it a little. I started with it, and I kind of forgot about it. And so in the end, I came back to it. Yeah. But it did talk about what kind of humour it is. So it's not an easy task. This is a hard task because you've got to remember quotes, you've got to remember what happens and what the key moments are. Do remember though, whatever you're talking about, you need to know the last quarter of your text. You know, if I picked 4 poems of poets here, you could have talked about more. It's hard with poetry to talk about more than say 5 in an essay like this. And I picked later ones mostly. The poets sort of write through the 80s and 90s because I know that that's where the things are coming together. Same in your, whatever you're dealing with. Yes, whatever the question's asking, think about what happens at the end of Heart of Darkness. Think about what happens at the end of Twelfth Night. Because that can actually, what is endorsed and what isn't endorsed is often in that final quarter of the text, where things are tied together. So that's important to remember. All right, let's have a go back and we'll have a look at passage analysis again to remind us about those who aren't there. But as you can see in this reading here, I went through and I found 4 different readings from a postmodern, a feminist, a Marxist, and a psychoanalytic reading, and a post-colonial reading of Falls. And for any text you can generally find relevant readings, but you don't need to name them. I never named any of them. Some of the ideas I extracted from them. Yeah. And you can plagiarise, it's an exam. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can't plagiarise an exam unless you've written it on your leg. That's cheating, not plagiarising. What I'm saying is, in exams, you're not plagiarising. What I mean is, if you can't take, like, I literally, sometimes I sit there and I think, like, I listen to music a lot, so I'll sit there and think, okay, what is that other lyric? Like, here's the question, it's about love, it's about abrasiveness. Like, what do I know about love? You know, like, the other day, my English class were doing ones, like how they're doing the Crucible and Year of Wonders, and the question was about heroes. I was like, okay, well, we don't need another hero. That song's Tina Turner. I was like, we don't need another hero. What's that song about? And then I was like, okay, well, societies that need heroes need them because they're shit. Good societies don't need heroes. And then what's the problem with, like, people who want to be heroes? They're problematic. Plenty of them around. You know what I mean? It's like when they advertise for a job for who wants to be the school captain, you're like, you should just pick the person who doesn't apply. Because they'll be the most well-adjusted. Just randomly pluck them out. There you come. The kids came, they were doing a survey on leadership, they came and asked me, what makes a good leader, Mr. Crofts? And I was like, someone who doesn't want to be one. Which obviously they weren't, because they were like, going to be leaders. So, they didn't come and ask any more questions. Alright, so if we have a look back at the earlier sections here, let's go back to the front of the handout now. We'll move on to section B, close reading and passage analysis. Not that it's not used to you, because obviously you're not writing the text, but I'll share, I'll give that to Michaela to post it. I had a student 3 years ago now. She got 50 for English and for she did the both. And I must admit, and I just said to her, give me at the end, I was like, give me a minute. They were mine as well. And they give them to me, but I don't remember hardly. And she said, so she didn't. Some of her stuff, and the vocabulary is amazing. Like, she had like 2 for one's to talking about texts, so like just your general academic and analytical vocabulary. And then she had the text specific, ones that she'd extend on them, like she'd put them in group and then like extend on them. And like I have a very good vocabulary, but you can see it coming through in the thing. I don't want to say, well, what are the words for abrasive? Like, I just need to know what they are. You just need to know kind of dictionary. You need to know. You need to think about what are the 20 likely questions I can be asked, and what do I need to come up? What words keep coming up? How do I write about this movie? How do I write about that character trait? Building both good vocabulary, because this is literature and I look for it. The hardest part, for me, for everyone, reading the sample ones, I see it's hard for those students that got very high marks with the grammar. Practice with grammar. If you look at that sample one, the way I use semicolons to be able to, the way I use commas to
provide a reflexive complex compound sentence. Also, not just using grammar functionally, using it artistically to emphasise the point. You know, this is the only subject where you really get enough on. Because in English, they don't actually really care about how pretty you sound. But in literature, they care not about how pretty you sound, but how meaningful you are. So, grammar is the hardest part of the task, I think. And being able to use it to write reflexively. Like, reflexively means like your elbow, like it could be in both ways. Do you know what I mean? Like, the elbow's only half reflexive. Which is annoying when it's someone you don't like what you're behind. A close reading of passages. Imagine if you can get away with a lot of it. If you're bad in the Me Too era, you could be a lot of
how would you tread the line between being too verbose and being?
Well, it's style. You have to practice and practice. It's hard under pressure. You know, like the more you have to. It's hard to. But too verbose is. It's up to the person. The assessors seem not to mind it. I hate, as a marker, and then even as a student at university, especially in literature, I hate like wanky, made-up words. Like, you know, academic stuff sometimes I'm making up their own vocabulary just to esoterically alienate anyone who hasn't spent 100 grand on the degree, so that you can't start to understand it unless you did what was spent 100 grand at the uni. Do you know what I mean? Be clear. I was a journalist before I was a teacher, and you're taught, if you can say it in 4 words, with 2 syllables in each, say those words. But also, English has pretty much the biggest vocabulary of any language, and there's always a better word. You know, like you need to know about how many words are actually good in English compared to a lot of other languages. And how, yeah. The only one in English that's lacking, there's some words that are lacking, like relatable isn't a word. Whereas you say, oh, that character is relatable, or this is relatable, but relatable isn't a word. So it's not actually a word. The relatability of something, you say, oh, this is relatable, oh, I find it relatable. It's not a word. And the other thing is love. Like, a lot of other languages have lots of words for love. Like in Spanish, there's like words for love that give, like, qualify the types of love. Do you know what I mean? Like, whereas here we're just like love. And then you have to have another word with love to give a qualifier. So sometimes English is lacking, but on the whole, like, I think English has like 4 times as many words as Italian in its vocabulary. So it's yeah. So when I say I don't think it's the same like German. But yeah, don't be too verbose. I don't think it's good. I don't think it sounds good. Alright. A close reading and passage analysis writing involves the following. You question the passages. You interrogate the passages. You analyse well and use analytical language effectively. You interpret. Don't just analyse, you have to interpret again. Give your view. Not with personal friends, obviously, but connecting, comparing, and contrasting within and or between them. You must use 2 of the passages. I think I mentioned last time, for those who were here, that for me that means passage 3. Yeah.
Within passages, do you explicitly say this is like the second passage, or do you just
You don't need to. You can. I reckon do it sparingly.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like with we using collective pronouns in academic writing. Like sometimes, and I use them occasionally in essay. Sometimes using us, our, we can be powerful because you're moving. But if you're always using us, our, and we, you're being presumptuous that everybody's reading the text the same. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of got to be cautious. So don't keep referring passage 1, passage 2, passage 3, but sparingly, it's okay. Yeah. Use meta language, look for patterns, find significance or revelation in these. There's no sort of set reading that's expected. You know, they don't expect a reading. Like I said last time, and for those of you who were last time, I think passage 3 is important because it's where, because they're all chronological, either from the year of the publication of the poems or the short stories, or because they move through the book chronologically. Passage 3, you have to deal with what happens in passage 3 because it can change the reading of 1 and 2. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you're not using it as your close analysis, you need to be mindful of it because they're talking to each other. And passage 3 is sometimes saying to the other 2, fuck off. Do you know what I mean? Like, sorry, but things have changed by the time you got to me. You know? So be careful with passage 3. Because I think it kind of answers, it can sometimes give the thing, you know those bits where you're explicating? Sometimes the explicating means sometimes passage 3 offers that. Frame an analytical discussion. Don't just think, sometimes, the one thing I'd say is it's a fine line. You don't want to be so structured with passage analysis that you're reductive. And yet at the same time you don't want to be so unstructured that it meanders and doesn't go anywhere. Do you know what I mean? So you've got to kind of get, I don't know how to do it, it's each individual, but you've got to basically find a loose enough structure that enables you to do that close analysis that can be a bit tangential sometimes, but still something that doesn't meander around into nothing. I think a framework rather than a contention is how I like to think about it. Like I think of a framework or a coat hanger rather than a contention, per se. Explore, have nuance, justify, always justify. Often the reading won't have justification. You know, it'll be offering an analysis of the passage and what's happening in it, but there's not actually the textual justification. You don't need to quote, don't quote large quotes. Little quotes. 4, 6, 8 words from the passages. Because there's no reward for quoting from things that are in front of you. You know, if you're going to quote a large section, if you're going to quote 4 lines or something, or, 40 words, then you better be damn well saying a lot about those 40 words. You know what I mean? Like, you better be really unpacking them. Because they're on the page, so there's no enough for quoting. From conducting a close reading, you then display out to connect to wider significances rather than reverse. Don't do the reverse. Don't start with the wide and then do the close reading. Do the close reading, and as you explain and analyse the literary aspects of it, connect to the wider context. It's kind of the opposite to literary perspective, although actually I think it's understanding that too, really. Always keep the title of the text or the poem in mind, and the genre. And the style, like Speed is a pastoral, Ode to Karl Marx, a love poem, whatever they are. Like in poetry, think about the form of the poem. If it's a novel, think about its genre. When you're analysing. If you try to remember the passage either side of the one if you can, try to remember the passages either side of the one you've been given. So think about the one you've got and the two that you're going to make the main focus. You can use all 3, but you have to use 2, yeah? So think about the ones that, like, if you know, like, what happened just before this? You know, what happens just after this? What's the next thing that happens? If you can't, you can't. But if you can, think about, this is just it, and then this happens. Because that can give more context. Sometimes you think, like, why did that give these passages? I think I said last time, I remember that one year, like, these passages was Jane Austen. I thought, these passages. And then I laughed at it, like, they're all about the houses they live in. Like, I was like, they're all random. There's nothing, they're not even like key moments in the book. Nothing's happened in any of them. But they were descriptions of where people lived. You know, like with different households. And I was like, well, this is Regency England, and it's all about money and property, and women's property. And then it begins to say, hang on, well, I start to read this as metaphor. You know. So, again, you can have to read them that way. You could have gone, these are hard passages. Sometimes they are. But when I thought about it, actually, they are connected. So I guess it's like kind of being like, it's kind of like being a good actor where you have to remember your lines and then deliver them like you've never heard them before. And the way that you do that is by listening to the other actor. You know, like best actors are good listeners, so they listen, they remember their lines on word for word, just like a robot. And then they listen as though they're hearing the thing for the first time. And it's kind of like that with the passages. You go in with these preset ideas about what the text is about, what you've learned, what you've studied, but you've still got to listen to what's in the passages in front of you. Do you know what I mean? Like otherwise, you'll put a reading on the passages rather than letting the passages generate the reading. You get what I mean? Okay, what should students consider in a close reading?
The meaning of the words, both literal and figurative ones. How they make the readers feel or think. Think about like assonance, dissonance, not just like, yes, words can have connotations, but sometimes they also literally denote something. And sometimes that denotation is actually powerful. Why that word instead of that word? You will need to make vocab lists for your texts and for talking about them, so two, one for each, one about texts and one for them. The cultural, historical, political and social references and the views and values being explored about them. In other words, the themes, but don't use that word. The genre, structure, devices, tropes and symbolism. Be comfortable grappling with ambiguities in your writing, both in terms of analysing meaning and ideas, but also lexical ambiguity in the passages. Practice, that's the hard bit where the grammar gets hard. When you're dealing with a contradiction or ambiguity, or it's like, yeah, that's true, but that's also, but this is not true because of this, and you know, you have to try and write that ambiguity. It's easy to talk the ambiguity, it's harder to write it. You have the grammar to do it. The structure and function of the characters. Don't forget, like, often you'll read essays and it's like the characters are written like, this character is a vehicle or a tool or an avenue. It's like, yeah, but they're also not a person. And, you know, like, people, you know, don't like kind of just think of the character as, yes, you want to know that they're constructed. They're not real people in most cases. Sometimes they are in the book, but we're supposed to read them as real people. Otherwise, it's a crappy book.
Just a quick question. If I was doing while or like close readings, and you can't say that like, oh, what she wrote here was about her life. You can't. You can only do that with the speaker, right?
Oh, in poetry.
Yeah. Can you say that that was
Again, it's a fine line. I think it's okay to touch on it.
like that? That was like the reading that you treat. Oh, that was a reference to her mother or something.
You say may. Perhaps a reference to. Yeah, perhaps a reference to. Are you talking about class or something?
Yeah.
Perhaps a reference to class mother. Passingly. But you don't want to give it a whole. It's okay to touch on it. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Just don't go into it like for hours. Yeah. I mean, in class case, it's particularly important because it is about life. Yeah.
When writing about plays, to what extent do we need to consider dramatic elements to say, for instance, talking about stage directions?
Oh, heaps. Yeah, I reckon. It's hard. Like Shakespeare, for instance, doesn't use any. So it depends on what you get. Like some playwrights, which one are you talking about? I don't know. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, a lot. If they're in the passages, talk about them. Because, I mean, they're essentially the artistic devices that you can't, like in plays, you can't relate what's inside the character's head, other than just a little bit. So, or on the side, yeah, so I think they're very important. My students were writing on Arthur Miller in English, and we're not doing a play for read, but they, yeah, I was not them to do that, sure, a lot. Yeah. And the acting direction, it's not just the stage, sometimes the acting direction. Be careful though, like, with distinguishing between those two. You know, what is the direction to the actor and what is the direction to the stage manager? Yeah, be careful. Any action? Oh, we can read this one. So if you have any other questions, we've got 3 minutes, so, or any other questions yet?
I noticed the Crofts essay last year was a bit of a controversy of how darkness comes out, like, oh, it's too pushy towards focus writing. What would you say?
I don't think it is though.
So when you get a prompt like that,
Like when I was reading, when I just showed you that one on John Ford,
yeah.
I wanted to do a Marxist reading of John Ford. The prompt wasn't asking for a Marxist reading, but I still dealt with the prompt.
So just
Just adjust your... Yeah. But, you know, obviously, if your text has got, like, know a few things, no matter what your reading is, you should know a few things about post-colonialism in relation to hard done, but your reading. But likewise, if you're doing class, you'd be mad not to know some feminist interpretations about it, but you're reading them. Yes.
I might just be being a bit thick, but at the start you were talking about how obviously the writer intended to write it a different way to how we read it and how we have to acknowledge.
Not always, but yeah.
So like in terms of Shakespeare, the context in which he wrote, and we have to acknowledge or recognise that.
I don't think you need to recognise that. You need to recognise that your reading is a reading.
So we don't
We don't know what Shakespeare intended We can write about what Jacobean or Elizabethan society was like and that context, but we can't know what Shakespeare is. So but you need to know.
To what extent do we need to consider staging with Shakespeare? Because I'm just thinking about Twelfth Night. It's been staged in so many different ways. Like, how do you go about talking about that?
You can actually make a quick reference to a different production, but I mean, Shakespeare doesn't give a lot of direction on that staging. I don't think you particularly need to. I think these days you're reading in Shakespeare's plays. It's a bit different because in Essex postmodern, it's much more pointed. Yep.
Like with some like poetries like Christmas craft work, there's a lot of like detail given that is a personal life. How much do we need to write that?
If the poet is giving you detail about their personal life, you can do it. But just don't presumptuously assume things too much. Like, obviously, like, for instance, if I'm writing about Tennessee Williams, I mean, he's a flaming homosexual. I'm going to talk about, like, I would want to think about the suppressed queer in his work. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's there. I don't have to. But, like, find some reference there and, like, yes, those are things there.
Passing analysis to it, essentially referencing
Passingly and particularly the end of the text, perhaps. Do you know, like, if the passages are all from early on and you don't think about how it's resolved later, but not too greatly. No. Maybe, like, I kind of sort of say, like, you go and find, like, the 50 moments of the text that most speak to you, and remember lines from them, but you don't have to use them.
like using the language of perspectives in the essay, if there's a part of the prompt that doesn't particularly apply to how you're reading it, but you still are responding to that in response, does that still need to be from the perspective of like a school of thought, or can you just discuss that for a while?
You just discuss it. You don't need to have any school of thought at all. You don't even. I did in that model, but you don't. This is for Marcus. So you don't have to have any. It can just be a critic's view that completely is separate from. The thing is, critical theorists will argue that every kind of thing is situated within a school of thought, but you don't have to. It doesn't have to be ideological. So no, you don't have to. You can. All right, good luck, guys. There's some more handouts if you want any for a friend or something.